everyone. Thank you for joining us here at our Nurau Talks every Friday or every other Friday where we host experts from all over to talk about mental health at the workplace. And today we're very honored to have Dr. Julianna Pillemer. Dr. Pillemer, she is a researcher currently at the New York University Stern School of Business. But before that, she received a BA in psychology from Pomona College and then a PhD in management from the Wharton School of Business at UPenn. And so before she joined the New York Stern School of Business, she worked as a research associate at Harvard Business School and the Center for Creative Leadership. Her research examines the complex dynamics of interpersonal connections at work. So something that we also at Nurau are very interested in talking about, kind of how those connections work, why they're important. And specifically, her research explores how our professional relationships can be really good sources of motivation and support, but they can also be hindering if they're not managed effectively. And we'll talk a bit about what it would look like to manage those relationships. And also another part of her research looks at the expression of non-work identities and authenticity at the workplace. So Dr. Pillemer, we're really excited to have you. Thank you for joining us here at our Nurau Talk.
Thanks so much for having me. This is exciting.
So I'm just going to dive in really quickly here into your work. So I spent the week, reading through your papers, and one thing that really struck me about your papers is how you navigate these tensions we experience at work. And a lot of times we hear the message, okay, as a manager, you need to build psychological safety in your teams, and to do that, you need to be willing to share and be authentic. And so there's this push for managers to be authentic with their teams. And yet the counterpoint to that, which you highlight in your work, is that in professional settings, we still need to kind of have appropriate ways of expressing emotion and certain things that are okay and not. And so we can't just always be fully ourselves. But I don't really find many people talking about that tension. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a bit about that paradox and what your research is finding about that tension managers experience.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you find it interesting. I find this really fascinating and also interesting that not that many people are talking about it. But absolutely, as I started to think about, this push to bring your whole self to work and be vulnerable and all of these things that sound really great. And I do believe there's a lot of value in sort of being able to at least bring parts of yourself to work that you wouldn't normally. There's, of course, still all of the professional demands that we have, right? And there's all the norms that govern our behavior in organizations that are just as strong as before. And so I think when I started talking to, my friends and other place and thinking about my own experience, there was this sort of underlying tension that people didn't talk about, which is really, if both of these, if there's a demand to sort of be perceived as authentic, be perceived as real, be perceived as vulnerable, and then also be seen as professional and competent and sort of fitting into whatever the workplace norms are, how do people balance this and navigate this? And so that's something that I've really looked into, both at the workplace and also for less traditional jobs. So I actually study social media artists who post their work on social media and think about how they navigate the tension between, doing kind of what their audience wants them to do and kind of staying true to themselves. So it's definitely a thread that runs throughout my work and I think has applications in a lot of different domains, not just like traditional organizations.
Yeah, great. So if I could ask a follow-up question to that, it would be, what do you think are the greatest challenges about that tension? So what do you think is hard about being professional and authentic at the same time? If you could maybe give us a specific example.
Yeah, so part of what I've written about in my there's an additional tension to this, which is I think that the people tell you to bring your whole self to work, but everyone's whole self kind of looks different. And for some people, that may be a better fit in the organization than not. There's another problem, which is like research has shown that we're actually not that good at telling when other people feel authentic. So I could be behaving in a way that really feels authentic to me, and it's not going to be perceived that way. And so there are all these kinds of issues that are raised when you examine the research on this stuff. And when you just talk to people about their lives that, it's just a big challenge. So what I write about my work too is this is also different for different people from backgrounds, right? So in a male-dominated field, what it looks like, an appropriate way of sort of expressing your authenticity differently than like a male in his firm. And, I can get into the nitty-gritty of that. I'm not sure how much time we have with that, but yeah, there are different ways to see, and that the most advantageous way to do that kind of depends on who you are in the situation.
Right. Yeah, let's talk a bit about that actually, the signaling authenticity, because I think that's what a lot of managers are asking. It's like, okay, you want me to be authentic, but what does that actually mean? What can I actually do to signal authenticity? So what would you say in your research? I know in our research, when we read through papers, like there's this act of self-disclosure. So saying something that's, that maybe no one else knows about you, that can be an act of vulnerability. What are some signals that you think that in your research you found tell people that, I'm being authentic?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned one of the sort of domains that I talk about is expressing things about yourself and about the work. So, less risky ways and so you don't have to go into work and like bury your soul in order to be seen as authentic, but just small instances of being a little bit more open and a little bit more transparent. Sorry, my earring just fell off. Take out the other one. And yeah, so that it's very meta. Maybe that was an authenticity signal. Something like your earring falling off, right? Maybe everyone can realize that I'm a human too, and a little bit more vulnerable. I promise I didn't plan that. But yeah, essentially just so that's one of them, is kind of expressing what's internal. So when we think about authenticity is really this alignment between your and what you're expressing externally. So the way I think about it is, in order to show people that those two things are aligned, there's kind of two ways you can do it. The first is the self-expression, where you say, okay, this is what I'm actually feeling, and this is what, is really going on in my heart or just in my mind. The second is what I call social deviation, separating yourself from the behavior of those around you, and then those people around you can know, okay, they're not necessarily just conforming to what everyone else is doing, but they're kind of willing to think for them. So those are kind of the two overall dimensions. Within those, it's funny that this earring thing just happened as a perfect example of like this idea of spontaneity, right? Where you kind of deviate from the script. It's not something that was planned, and you kind of have to go with it, versus a planned act of nonconformity. So you can be nonconforming and, I could have had pink hair today, and that would be a little bit nonconforming, or something that clearly was planned to go in and didn't happen on the spot.
Yeah. I love that. So, authenticity is one part of it, but kind of taking a hard turn into your other aspect of research, which is workplace friendship. I was curious to learn a bit about, we always hear about loneliness being a problem in the workplace, and we need to find ways to build more connection. And I think you would agree with that we do need to be creating more connection, but also that having friends at work, there are also some things that we don't really think about all the time, and that leaders need to be aware of when they're managing workplace connections. Could you talk to us a bit about what those downsides or challenges may be?
Yeah. So this study also came from a place of being someone who really values workplace. My relationships are the reason I show up to work. And I think a lot of people feel that way. And nonetheless, when you work with your friends, we all know that there are challenges that come up. There's some tensions based on like, am I acting as your friend right now, or am I acting as your colleague? Right. And so there's this constant management written about that. But like you said, I think relationships and friendships at work are so incredibly important, especially now as we're moving into this sort of hybrid workplace, that I think some people's reactions once they've had a bad experience with sort of working with a friend or having a breakup, with a friend in an organization, is they just say, I'm not friends with, I'm just not going to have friends, or I'm just not going to try to build those relationships with my colleagues. And I think that's actually problematic. But on the other side of the coin, I think for organizations to just sort of throw caution to the wind and say, Everett, let's all hang out together and let's all be best friends, right? There's also challenges that arise when you're an institution in that way. So I think my work really advocates for this kind of balance where you do pursue friendships at work. They're super important, but you keep in mind that a friendship relationship is very different from the typical coworker relationship in a number of it's, one is involuntary, one is kind of governed by different norms of exchange. So for friends, you'd give because you like them. For colleagues, something just popped up here. I'm hoping colleagues, you basically, need to do things for them just because you have to as a job. And so a number of ways in which these relationships are different. So I think just conscious management and being aware of these tensions that can come up can help guard against the dark sides.
Yeah, that's good. Going to a question we have here from someone listening called Kevin. Kevin asks, how do you build awareness and create a resource hub for employees to deal with mental health? And maybe to make it more specific to your area of research and connection, would you recommend that managers just say, let's have a happy hour, that's kind of where we're going to find resources and, talk about mental health? Or do you think there could be more directed ways in which we can, help employees, give them resources around mental health?
Yeah, this is great. I think some of my work has looked at how organizations can create gathering spaces. So spaces that feel like they're informal and in serendipitous encounters. So instead of like forcing people to hang out and talk about mental health at a specific time, maybe creating a space, whether it's, sort of a physical space in which people can kind of bump into each other, or we've people do this in virtual spaces. So using exercise platforms to take classes together, and then it like opens up this whole stream of talking about how you're feeling. And so it's challenging for managers I think managers have to be really aware that like forcing people to have these kinds of conversations can be challenging sometimes. So I think like working on kind of indirectly creating spaces where people safe to talk about these things, or like you said, outside of work with a happy hour or an exercise class or someplace virtual. That's really what I've found is like kind of the best way to approach these issues. But as you note, it's not like my exact area of study, but I think that relationships are something that's really critical to mental health.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And so lastly, you talked about pivoting to remote work and how, social media and technology is really going to be a big part of, it already is a part of our work. How do you think that's affecting or influencing both authenticity and workplace friendship?
If you did for everyone else, but I think I got the gist of your question. So on the one hand, the movement to virtual and hybrid work is causing a bit of a crisis in terms of relationships. Some people it's not as easy to form relationships virtually as it is face to face for most people. On the other hand, we have technologies like social media, like these other virtual platforms, which can enable people to be connected no matter where they are. And so I think that and it's other thing these technologies have done is really blurred the boundaries between work and home. So it's no longer like you just show up to a work and then you leave, but you're always kind of connected to people. And so I do think it requires more relationships, and maybe to tailor the boundaries in a way that feels good for you in terms of authenticity, but with effort and with sort of consciousness about it, I think people can create the type of space and the type of relationships that they're really excited about. So yeah, I think there's sort of more challenge, but more opportunity with these new technologies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, lots to talk about. We have come to the end of our 15 minutes, though. So if any of you would like to keep up with Julianna, with what she does have lots of papers out there. You can definitely research what she does and read more about her work. But we will close this LinkedIn Live by thanking you, Julianna, for coming on and really for this authentic conversation about managers and social media.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was fun. So all the best in your research, and yeah, we'll connect soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being